just as a follow-up to the Angiosperms pictures. There's also pictures linked to in the book. But you've got fertilization, opening the cone, eventually releasing the seed, growing into the sporophyte, producing the male cones and the female cones. The male releases the pollen. The egg cells develop in an ovule in the female cones, produce one egg cell and three polar bodies. You get the, well, it doesn't really show the pollen tube, but eventually, oh, there's the pollen tube. You get fertilization, and we're back to where we started. You know the old joke. What's worse than finding a worm in an apple you just bit into? Finding half a worm in an apple you just bit into. But this doesn't say that. This says, egad, it's got an Uncle Jake. Fruit. It's a feature of the last group, the Angiosperms. There's a number of different things that you show up in the Angiosperms. Flowers. The flowers hold the gametophytes. There's male gametophytes and female gametophytes in flowers. Most flowers are going to have both. There'll be male gametophytes and female gametophytes in the same flower. Not always true, because sometimes there's male and female flowers, sometimes there's male and female plants, where male plants have male flowers, female plants have female flowers. But typically, they're monoecious. The stamen is the male part, the pistil is the female part. I mentioned before the anther produces the pollen, that's part of the stamen. Not going to throw too many particular terms at you. Again, you've got pollen and pollen tubes. As often happens when you're taking a biology class, I'm going to throw a term at you that you go, I know what that means, and I'm going to go, no, you don't. Is that when you think of a fruit, you're only thinking of a subset of what a fruit truly is. A fruit is a structure to take seeds and get them away from the parent plant. Now, one of the ways to do that is to make the casing around the seeds edible, so that things eat the fruits, they swallow the seeds resist digestion, they come out the other end a goodly distance away from the original plant, very often with a little bit of fertilizer. But if you're walking through high grass and you come out and you've got all sorts of burrs stuck to your pants, those are fruits. Is that they also are a way to get the seeds that are embedded in the burrs away from the parent plant. The little whirly things that come off of maple trees are a type of fruit. It's carried by the wind away from the parent plant. So there's many, many, many different types of fruits. When people start to talk about foods and they go, is it a fruit or is it a vegetable? Typically they will define fruits as things that do have seeds in them. Whether the seeds are viable or not. A lot of times we breed plants for a certain trait, and along the way, we lose the fertility. And then we have to use asexual reproduction in order to keep growing the plants. Didn't you ever wonder how they grow seedless watermelons? They take cuttings. But many, many, many different types of fruits. Now, the angiosperms appeared to have evolved through the middle to late era of the dinosaurs. And because sometimes people look at a correlation and go, well, there's got to be a connection. There's some people that have theorized that the rise of the angiosperms spelled the end of the dinosaurs. That there was something about the angiosperms that the dinosaurs couldn't keep up with. Of course, that's an old theory when we thought that the ending of the dinosaurs was fairly gradual. But you still see it occasionally, where, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but you'll run into it if you do a lot of reading in that area. The idea that plants and animals are very intimately associated with one another, when you get to angiosperms, dead on, is that you get a lot of coevolution between plants and animals. People like drugs. The hell is he talking about? We derive nicotine from tobacco, a whole bunch of different drugs from poppies, THC from marijuana. All of those are in the plant as insecticides. They are neurotoxins that are pretty good at dissuading insects from eating the plants. When you think about it, if you're going to kill insects, and you can't really catch them and stomp on them, which a plant can't do, and you can't do most of the time, then the way to do it is to poison them somehow. And one of the more certain ways of poisoning them is to get into their nervous system and screw their nervous system up. That's what RAID does also. So a lot of our human-derived pesticides also do that. But nicotine is a neurotoxin. I forget what the active chemical in poppies that we derive cocaine, opioids and stuff from, but that's also a neurotoxin. And THC is a neurotoxin. Now, it's less toxic in us than it is in insects, but it still gets into your brain and messes with it. It is part of the conflict. Let's keep these guys from eating us. Spines are part of the conflict. Defensive sap, the sap that over eons becomes amber, is actually a battle against insect invaders. Bad taste. There are some plants that can generate a very nasty chemical, but they do it on demand. It's somewhat expensive, not super great continually for their chemistry, but if you start chomping on the plant, it will release pheromones, and the leaves on the plant that are nearby, and on nearby plants as well, will start to generate a nasty tasting chemical. So you're eating and you're eating and you're eating, and then you start eating and you go, oh geez, this really started to taste really bad, and you go on and find something else to eat. So a lot of coevolution. You think of something like monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are poisonous, but they don't make their own poison. They actually ingest the poison from the milkweed that they feed on. Milkweed produces poisons, so very, very few insects can eat milkweed. But monarch butterfly caterpillars have co-evolved with the milkweed to not only be able to resist the effects of the toxin, they actually integrate the toxin into their own tissues so that they also become toxic. So sometimes coevolution gets a little wacky, but There's a lot of arms race that goes on between, you know, there are animals that can eat cactuses. The spines are supposed to keep you from eating them, but there are some animals where their mouths are just really, really tough. And so they can just chow down on the cactuses and the needles don't particularly affect them. Now, of course, we're more familiar, when you talk about coevolution of plants and animals, you're much more likely to be talking about pollinators and seed spreaders, where they don't spread pollen necessarily. Some things still spread pollen through the air. Anybody who has hay fever can tell you there's a lot of angiosperms that spread their pollen through the air. And if you know somebody with hay fever and they start sneezing, and you're feeling, you know, that you don't mind if they throw something at you, you go, sorry, you suck some sperm up your nose? Because keep in mind, pollen is basically a sperm casing. Sorry. So then you can say, see, I learned something in biology. Anyway, but there's a lot of insects that co-evolve with the plants. The plants produce a bribe for them. Here, come in and have some nectar. Here, I'll produce lots and lots of actually nutritious pollen. You can actually eat and digest some of it as long as you carry some of it to the next plant over. Some of it gets a little weird, is that there are plants that look like the back end of a female beetle and produce the pheromones that a female beetle in heat will produce. And a male beetle will respond to the pheromones, come into what it thinks is the female beetle. It's not a lot. We'll talk about behavior late in the semester. It just follows certain cues, and the plant matches the cues. And the beetle comes in and literally mates with the flower. Here's coevolution. The flower is built so that the anthers that have the pollen, the main part of the plant that the beetle lands on are modified petals, and the female part is up above, and the male part is up above. The beetle grabs the flower, and the male and female parts come down and touch the back of the beetle. If the beetle's already done this on a flower, there's pollen there. The female part picks the pollen up. If not, there's pollen deposited there to be carried to the next flower. In this case, the beetle just thinks it's getting something from this exchange, but it's still a type of coevolution. And in fact, if you look at flowers, is that flowers can be pollinated by insects that crawl. And in that case, the flower will tend to be very broad and flat, and often not that far off the ground. So the insects that crawl up, and they crawl across the male and female parts and pick the pollen up and deposit the pollen. Some flowers have, you know, these big flowers with this tall, almost a landing pad in the middle. And that's going to be pollinated by flying insects that come in and land on the landing pad. If there's already pollen on them, they deposit the pollen on the top of the pistil. And then the food is down at the bottom, so the flying insects have to get down through the flower. They pick up pollen on the way. They get their reward from the bottom. They go crawl back out, and away they go. So coevolution is definitely a big angiosperm feature, both on the upside and on the downside. So a lot of times there's a symbiosis going on. Not always, but a lot of times. So the sperm gets down the pollen tube, gets down to the female. The egg cells, sperm and the egg get together, they form a zygote. The zygote grows into an embryo. The embryo is encased in a casing of some sort, and that becomes the seed. The seed, the area of the gametophyte around that becomes the fruit. The ovaries of the flower become the fruit, whatever the fruit is, as a way to get, and because we tend to think of the fruits as being edible, usually edible fruits are not like huge oranges and apples and stuff. We've bred those to maximize the edible part of the fruit. The wild versions are much more limited in how much bribe there is for animals to come in and pick the seeds up. Even crab apples are kind of big compared to the sort of bribes you typically get in wild fruits, even the edible kind. So the seed gets out there, and it winds up someplace where it can grow. And at some point it will sprout, it will germinate, it will produce a little plant. When? Well, it depends on the environment. Around here, you have a winter to deal with, and typically seeds are set up to get through the winter. And so they're not just gonna sprout any old time. And in fact, some of the plants around here get really screwed up if we have like a 2-week really warm period in February, and you see plants start to sprout that shouldn't have sprouted yet because it's gonna get cold again. But the cue that they're working off of is a certain length of warmth. Not just warmth, because around here you get, sometimes really warm days, sometimes a couple of really warm days, but a sustained warmth is going to cause germination. Some plants like, oh crap, can't think of the little guys that sprout, that looks, crocuses. Crocuses are pretty hardy in terms of cold, so they're up and sprouting very, very early in the spring, and it's not unusual for them to get covered by snow and frozen. They can handle that. But other things that, like tulips that would, tulips are a bad example. Tulips store their food in bulbs and then resprout the next year. They can spread seeds. I don't know that the commercial ones do. The ancestral wild ones do, but I don't know that the commercial ones, I don't know how they breed tulips. Not a plant guy. How many times am I gonna say that? But anyway, something sets it off. It could be temperature, it could be moisture, it could be a series of events. Like, how does a plant that germinates in June typically know that it's June? It could be photoperiod. It could be length of time that the light is up, or it could be a corresponding length of warmth through the course of the day. Because keep in mind, a lot of seeds, once they're out there, they get buried, and photoperiod's not necessarily a reliable cue for something that doesn't really get access to the light. All depends on the environment again. But what you typically get with germination is the seed is gonna crack, and what's gonna come out is gonna be two pieces. One piece is going to be the stem, go up and form leaves. One is gonna be the root system. There's a class of plant hormones called auxins. One set of auxins has a tendency to migrate away from light. They're often growth hormones of one sort or another. And so if you bring a plant home and you set it on a table and there's a window over here, you'll find that it's growing so the leaves are facing the light. Well, that's because the light's coming in the window, it's hitting the side of the stem that's more lit, and it's moving the auxins to the other side. And in a stem, auxins cause increased growth. So if this side grows faster than that side, it will make that side longer and bend it over. That's part of what's happening when it sprouts as well. This is a geotaxis. This is a response to gravity. Geo for Earth. So say the potential stem and the root both come out of the seed this way. So say this one is the root. It produces auxins. The auxins settle to the bottom by gravity. They hold back the growth of this side so that this side grows faster. So this gets longer than this side, and as it grows, it bends down. And when it's pointed down, the auxins are settling equally on both sides, so it's no longer, it's pointing down, it's gonna keep growing down. If this is the stem, the auxins still settle by gravity, but now this side grows faster than that side. So this side gets longer than that side, and it bends the plant up. And now again, equal settling on both sides, unless it breaks ground and there's more light on one side than the other. And again, it gets it to grow up. So again, it's not responding to light in this situation, it's responding to gravity, which is pretty dependable. Is that I said, seed can get buried, you don't necessarily know what the light is, but gravity's gonna be there. Plants grow differently than animals do. Plants add cells and then differentiate them. And they only add cells in certain areas. These areas are called meristems. When a root or a stem grows, the tip is making new cells. That's pushing the end of the tip forward, more cells, pushing it forward. As this area of new cells moves farther and farther along, the older cells behind it, they stop making new cells, they start to grow. Typically, early on, they grow long. They could call that the elongation zone. And again, that tends to push the tip farther along, down or up or whichever way it's going. But the cells that are behind the meristem are set there for the life of the plant. They may get bigger. They may set up meristems around the edges that will do things like grow bark or grow new xylem in a woody plant, or they'll get nodes, little pockets of new cells that will grow a side root off of the root, or a branch off of a growing tree, or leaves off of a stem. But it's new cell growth, and it's always working the tips. So that, say, well, okay, where I grew up, behind my house we had a hammock, and the hammock had been bracketed into 2 trees. Because of the way that the trees grew, if the hammock was at this height, it was always going to be at this height. Because trees don't grow the way that animals do, where if I stuck this into your knee, as you got bigger, the knee would get farther off the ground. Here, what eventually happens is the axial growth of the tree increased, adding layers and layers of xylem and pushing the bark out. And it did eventually engulf the brackets that held onto the hammock. You couldn't really get them out of the tree anymore. But they always stayed at the same height off the ground. And that's because trees grow differently than animals do. I said I was going to come back to this, and now I'm going to. Tree rings. Somewhere in this pile, I have a picture of tree rings. Ow. Sorry, these things want to fall on the ground. There we go. two guys looking. It says, and see this ring right here, Jimmy? That's another time when the old fellow miraculously survived some big forest fire. Yep, he survived right up until the time you chopped him down. Honestly, you know, they wouldn't have been using that that thing to cut through. At least not to get as clean a cut as that. What's a tree ring? Xylem is added layer by layer by layer under a woody stem. Now, not all angiosperms are woody. We'll get to that when we talk about the subgroups of the angiosperms. But they add new cells on the outside through the course of the growth. Now, most parts of the world are seasonal. Very obvious around here, we have the summer and winter, but even there's a lot of places where there's wet seasons and dry seasons. During a good part of the year where growth is good, the cells get big. They get spaced out. During an area where things are not so good, the growth continues, but the cells that are produced are little and packed in close together. So what you get is not a ring, you get a light ring and a dark ring, and a light ring and a dark ring. Good growth, bad growth, good growth, bad growth, good growth, bad growth. When you're looking at it as a human, what do you see? You see the dark rings. Those you can count. And if it's a yearly seasonality, and it isn't always, but in a lot of places in the world, you can count the years by counting the rings. And a good growth year will have a wider white area than a bad growth year. Around here, for the trees that are old enough, and there's not a lot of them that are old enough, you would see a very, very thin ring around, I think, 1815, when a big volcano erupted in the South Pacific, and it blanketed the earth with soot and caused in New York what they called the year without summer, where it actually snowed around here in July. And it was a very bad growth year. And you can see that in the tree rings. Most of the trees, when you go out and about here, most of the trees you see, even the really big ones, do not date back that far. If you want to get some idea on how big trees can get in a short period of time, go someplace around here where the Erie Canal has, you can walk along the Erie Canal and look at the trees that are growing where the canal used to be. Now, the canal was working up until the 1830s, 1840s, I think, maybe later than that. And these trees are huge. They obviously couldn't have started until the canal was no longer in use and it actually stopped having water in the bottom of it. Of course, it still has water in the bottom of it in some places around here. But those trees grow faster than you think they do. Even up in the Adirondacks, there's a lot of evidence that the locals they managed the forests in ways where even the old growth parts of the forest are not really that old. They may have been doing controlled burns long before ecologists developed controlled burns like 50, 60 years ago. But tree rings are a useful historical record, but they don't go back that far. Is that there are some trees that grow for thousands of years, but the rings you have to look at with a microscope. They're really hard to read. And again, this is like the fossil layers, is that maybe you found an old tree, the bits of an old tree that supported an old fort, and you can match some of these inner rings, these older rings, right? Newer to older. You can match these older rings to some rings from the wood from the fort, but that actually goes farther back in the past than this tree does. And maybe you can find some of those rings to correspond to wood from another source. A number of years ago, they found an old bridge, just a little, like planks on little X's driven into the bog that people used to cross a bog, like 2,000 years ago, something like that, in England. But because it was a peat bog, once the bridge stopped being used and it kind of fell into the bog, no oxygen, no real organisms that could break the wood down, the wood was still intact, and they could actually extend the record of climate for that part of England back a couple hundred years earlier than they'd been able to, because these were very, very old logs that have been used to make the bridges. Okay. The subgroups. I mentioned when we talked about, oh no, okay. We're gonna do the subgroups on the next video. I'm sorry, this went way too long. So I'm gonna stop here and we'll pick it up on the next video.